Welcome to the Woodward Chronicles. This series is dedicated to honoring the legacy of Mr. Ronald Woodward, who served as Wabash County historian from 1981 to 2025 and was awarded the title of Wabash County Historian Emeritus by the Indiana Historical Society. Mr. Woodward shares Wabash County's recorded history in his own words. Each episode invites us to listen, learn, and reflect on the rich stories from the past. Settle in, we're glad you're here.
The beginning of the 20th century in Wabash County was a very interesting time. A lot of new inventions were beginning to hit the public and change the way we in Wabash County would live. Very much like today in the 21st century, how the computer has kind of changed our way of life. And those forms of transportation that started to appear in 1900 were the interurbans, changes in the trains, and airplanes were beginning to appear on the horizon. But one of the most major changes to occur was the invention of the automobile. And Wabash County residents readily jumped on the bandwagon of the automobile. It's hard to believe, but even as early as 1901, the very first automobile or car appeared in Wabash County. It was an unusual car. It was a steam-driven car. It was called a locomobile, and it had been made in Milwaukee, the Milwaukee locomobile. It had a 12-gallon water tank, which produced the steam and allowed it to move. And the owner of that car was a fellow by the name of J.A. Bruner. Before long, there were other cars that appeared in the county. That same year, a car called the Marmon was purchased and brought into the county. Early residents such as T.J. and S.C. Lewis, both of Rowan, had cars. Dr. Hauser was a very prominent person who had an automobile, and Arthur McCracken all had automobiles before 1903.
Where would they have gotten them?
In those days, believe it or not, there were dealerships, but not the way we think of a dealership today. It was a man who just had a storefront, and you went in, you saw pictures of automobiles, and you asked, and then you paid for it, or you could postpone the payment until you got the car, and you had to go get the car from the dealership. McCracken had one of the first Fords in Wabash County, and he actually had to go to Detroit to get his car after he had ordered it. And he originally wanted a brand new car for about $1,000 in those days is what it would cost. But when he got there, they didn't have any new cars available, but they had a used one. And he bought it for $600 and brought it back to Wabash. And McCracken was a Model Ford, a Model F Ford that he purchased for $600 and brought it back to Wabash. And of course, he showed it off to people. And if people liked that brand, well, they would go to the man who was selling the cars, and then they'd go get their own car too. And you could special order exactly what you wanted, the color, the size of the engine, the make, whether it was a runabout or what have you. And so that's how they originally dealt with it. But in dealerships, the first dealership I know about was in 1910. But anyway, McCracken, with his car, he, of course, enjoyed showing it off. And McCracken was involved in the very first, well, actually the second accident to occur. In showing off his car, he took a few of his friends, about 4 friends, and they went on an excursion to North Manchester. Now, to get to North Manchester, they had to go over to Laketon and go over. And on the way, They were going down the road, and a farmer with a couple of horses was coming down the opposite direction. And McCracken, seeing these horses and the farmer, attempted to slow down, but he couldn't get the car to slow down, and he couldn't get it to stop. He pulled every lever that was on the machine. That's what they called cars in those days, the machine, and nothing would stop it or even slow the speed. So he went tearing into this farmer and his horses. The horses stampeded when it got close enough and ran away. The farmer was extremely mad, cussed them out, fussed at them, yelled at them. Somebody was riding a bicycle down the road. The farmer knocked him off his bicycle, got on the bicycle, and started chasing the car. He chased him down the road for a number of miles, but finally wore out, couldn't keep up with them. They were doing about 15 to 20 miles an hour, and he couldn't keep up with them on the bicycle. So he finally stopped, threw the bicycle over the side, went back and got his horses. The car kept going, no matter what. It just kept going, and whatever he did to stop it wouldn't stop it. In those days, instead of having a foot pedal to speed it up, they had a control switch on the driver's column on the steering wheel. You pulled that up or down to go fast or slow. It wasn't working. Finally, the car ran out of gas at the covered bridge in Laketon. Now, that story made the county newspapers, and everybody told that story about McCracken and how he was dangerous to be with and all that kind. But they never finished the story, so we don't know how he ever got home or how they ever fixed the car. In those days, a mechanic would have to come from Detroit to fix it. There weren't shops like there are today to fix it. McCracken also had another bad episode with his car. A few years later, in 1907, he'd bought a new car. I don't know what brand. But in 1907, the Wabash Street Methodist Church, they had an automobile fair. Automobiles were so rare and so uncommon that they invited all the owners of cars in Wabash County, which was about 24, to bring their cars and display them at the church and have a festival. I don't know how many showed up or anything. They didn't cover that in the newspapers, but what they did cover was McCracken. McCracken took his brand new car there to show it off. And then after the festival was over with, he decided he was going to take his friends down to Wabash City Park. So 10 of them piled into his car, and they took off Wabash Street to Hill Street. Everything was fine. Got onto Hill Street, started west on Hill Street to the city park, got down to Comstock Street. And for some reason at Comstock Street, the car spooked another horse and buggy and distracted McCracken, and he ran off to the side of the road and hit the curb and overturned the car and spilled all those 10 people out onto the streets. There were minor injuries and minor hurts and pains and aches and so forth, but whether they got to the park after that, I don't know. But that was the very first serious accident to occur in Wabash County. Not the first accident, but the first serious bodily injury that occurred in Wabash County. The very first accident, and again, it was a man. I have to point out that if you didn't catch that the first time, the first accident that McCracken had, he was a man. The second was also a man. That was a man by the name of Dr. Hauser, Dr. B.A. Hauser. A lot of doctors purchased cars because it was a good way to go out and visit their patients. Well, Dr. Hauser had this little car, and in 1904, his little 8-horsepower car could run about 30 miles per hour, and he was running down Miami Street, close to where you worked, running down Miami Street when his car, the wheels got stuck in the streetcar tracks. They got stuck in it, and they dropped down into it, and as he tried to fight getting out of the wheels, he twisted one of the wheels off and the car ran over into the sidewalk. That was the very first accident in Wabash County in 1904. Nobody was hurt, but it tore up the car. And of course, a lot of people had discussion about that. If you skip a few years ahead, and I want to tell you about another one, in 1924, a fellow by the name of Harold Talbot had a Dodge. Now, he parked that on the west side of Wabash Street in front of the courthouse. He had an errand to run over at Gackenheimer's, so he parked his car, stopped it, turned it off, ran across the street. As he was paying for his purchase, he looked out the window at his car and it wasn't there. After he had gone into the store, the Dodge had slipped somehow out of the brake and had started moving down the street. It got into the streetcar rail tracks also and careened on down through Market Street. And about here where the City Hall sits today, it hit two vehicles and then hit a woman and finally came to a stop. That was in 1924. In 1903, besides all these people having cars, we have an unusual event happen, which most people aren't aware of. In 1903, the LaFountain Post Office decided to start delivering their mail by automobile and became the very first rural mail delivery in Indiana. Then in 1907, a mail carrier by the name of Captain Henley began using an automobile to deliver mail out in the county for the residents out in the county. So all these things were building up and people were wanting cars and they were wanting to get out on the road and go places and do things. And the one thing I like about Wabash, and maybe we're not unique about this, but I think it's unique. We had men in Wabash who decided that, you know what, I can build a better car than what these people are bringing. And they not only had the skills to build them, but they had the foresight to improve upon them and make them. And those were very early entrepreneurs who saw a need and tried to fill it. And sometimes they were successful and sometimes they weren't. And some of these cars are still in existence today. The very first car, I'll show you an example of one, is this. This is a Maxwell, and it's a model of what was built in Wabash called the Rettig. Two brothers, the two Rettig brothers, along with their father, opened a hardware store on the south side of Wabash on the corner of Columbus and Vernon Street. And they decided to build a vehicle themselves. And what they did was they used a buggy wagon body and put a motor on it, but their motor was in the back here. It used bicycle tires, it used wooden sprockets, and it used a bicycle chain to make it move. And they built 7 of these. We don't know the exact year that they built them, but it was before 1905. And that was the very first automobile that we find in Wabash County to be made here by the Rettigs. The Rettigs later expanded to the north side and built 2 buildings. One building is still standing on Canal Street, and one building is right next to Wabash Visitor Center or Visit Wabash County Center, and it was used as an office. And you can see right above the building, right next there, it's the Rettig building. And that's where they didn't produce the cars there, but they had auto parts and things that they sold as well as other accoutrements as well. when the Reddigs started building, other cars started coming into town, and there was a need for dealerships. And the dealerships, the very first one was the Olinger and the Warville Ford Agency. And they started in 1906. And by 1910, they had a branch office in North Manchester. They later would sell out and become the Weber Company. But they helped you to obtain a car, and we talked about that a minute ago, and they would see that you get there and get them. One of the things about Ford, if you were a Ford owner, every year they would have a big festival up at Lucan's Lake for all Ford owners. They'd have a picnic, and they would have dancing, they'd show movies, they'd play games and water sports and all kinds of events for people who own Fords. You just drove up there and spent the day, and they'd have a picnic and provide food for them. Also, the Ford Motor Company really never took themselves too seriously. They were serious about their cars, but they realized that they had problems with them. And those early cars used to shake a lot. And one owner of a Ford car in Wabash, I can't remember his name, but one day he was riding in his Ford over in Miami County, where the circus museum, where it's located today. He was driving by there, and in those early days, those barns used to store animals during the wintertime that performed in the circus. And his Ford came upon a lion in the middle of the road. He stopped his car and got out and ran, but he left it running. The lion ate the car and died by shaking to death, because Fords were known to shake tremendously. Those were the kind of stories they would tell about Fords. Fords even printed postcards and would send them out with these jokes. And instead of backfiring, people, it was funny and people told about. Today we say Ford means found along the road dead, things like that. But back then, they told those stories very early. Now, there were other dealerships as well. These names might sound familiar. Cowgill, Honeywell, and Walter went into business, and they had a dealership selling Hupmobiles and Overlands, and they were right next to...
What was the first one, Mr. Woodward?
The Hupmobile.
Hupmobile.
Hupmobile, Huppmobiles, and the Overlands. And their office was right next to Visit Wabash County offices today. Then across the street, there was another agency where the Italian restaurant used to be. That was a car agency for a number of years. And if you go in there today, you can still see where the wall's been bricked up, but you can see where you could go into the building next to it, and they would have cars on display for you to see there. The Dr. Blount sold the Brush Roundabout, and if you think that sounds familiar, the Brush was the same man who invented the light that electrically lit up Wabash back in 1880. But he sold the Brush Runabout, and he was the very first dealer to actually advertise as a dealer in the newspaper. He actually bought an advertisement and showed a picture of what his car looked like. There was also the Watson and Swank dealership, and they also sold the Hupmobile. Then there was Nickham and Darnball, and there was McCoy and Fresher. Now, the thing about McCoy and Fresher was they were in LeGros, and they sold Maxwells. And again, if you want to see what a Maxwell looked like, it was like this. Now, I've got to tell you a story about this. Sorry about this, but I'm getting off the track here. But this is a toy I had in my youth. In the 1950s, this was a toy I had. It was made by the Revell Company, which made model cars. I don't think they do today, but they did up and through the 60s and 70s. And the Maxwell was made famous by Jack Benny. If you ever watched Jack Benny on TV or listened to him on the radio, he made fun of a Maxwell. He would make the sounds of what it sounded like and talk about how bad a car it was. It was made in Indiana. And it was the dealership in LeGros that sold these. The McCoy and Fresh Hours sold these until their plant burned down. Well, their business burned down. It had a tiller. It didn't have a steering wheel. It had a tiller. Now, in the 1950s, when I got this was a clown car. Kids would play with these like me. There's a hole in it here, and a clown would sit in here. And you had this tube that ran from the hole up to this little pump. And when you pushed it with your hands, the clown would jump out of the car seat. I've had that ever since. I think it was 1952. Oh, well, that just shows you, even at young age, we start collecting things.
Well, where's your clown at? Did you lose him along the years?
I lost the clown. I don't know what happened to him, but I kept the car because it looks like the early cars that were here in Wabash County.
That's awesome.
And it brings back memories to me.
For sure.
Running it down the street and having the clown jump up. He jumped up about, maybe a foot or so. But anyway, that's the first car there. The second car made in Wabash County, we don't have any pictures of, and we really don't know much about it. And it wasn't a car, it was a truck. It was made by the Barkus and Company. That was a foundry that was located down on South Carroll Street, in between Miami and Carroll. And it was a foundry, and they built a 3-ton truck that was 16 feet long and was 16 horsepower. And again, we have no pictures of it or anything else. We do know that it was used locally. They would move heavy equipment. They would move what they melted down or what they made, scrap metal and so forth. And that was the second car to be made. Now, the third car, I'm going to show you this one again, was similar to this, where the Rettig had the engine in the back. The DeWitt had the engine in front, and this was closely more resembled what we call the DeWitt. And the DeWitt was made in North Manchester, and they began in 1908. They built a factory in 1908 to produce the vehicle. By April of 1909, they had produced their first automobile. It was red in color, just like the car I showed you. It had red running gear, bright maroon body and seat with red leather trimmings. You could buy it with a top or without a top. If you got it with a top, the top was black. Its top speed was 15 to 20 miles an hour. It had 2 speeds, forward and reverse. That's all just forward and reverse. It was chain driven, and it had 13.6 horsepower engine. The main attraction was that they had a steering wheel instead of a tiller. It could seat 2 people. The plant was destroyed in 1910 and was never rebuilt. They went into bankruptcy at about the same time. The unusual thing about it was that the workers were paid about $3 a day. That was a tremendous amount of money at that time. The average factory worker made about 10 cents an hour and worked a 10-hour day, 6 days a week, with Sundays being off. The DeWitt that's up there today, there are DeWitts that are still around. I only know of one, and it's out in Missouri, or was out in Missouri. The DeWitt that's on display in the museum at North Manchester, it's a replica, and it was made and given to the museum. But before it was given to the museum, it was used in a play. I don't know if it was on Broadway or what, but it was used in a play and later was given to the museum up there. By the way, the Rettig, the first car made in Wabash, there were only 7 of them ever made. And back in the 1980s, I ran into a gentleman who owned one who lived in Michigan. He had come down to Wabash because he was applying for the job of superintendent of the Wabash City Schools, and to get familiar with the community before he went to his interview, he went on a tour of the museum, asked us questions about it, and wanted to share information that he had. It's the only one I know of in existence today. He has it, and still in Michigan. He wasn't hired, by the way. The most popular, well-known automobile in Wabash and truck was the service motor. And this is what a service motor truck looked like about 1919 or earlier. The service motor car company came to Wabash in 1911, and they set up in the old Wabash Bridge and Iron Works Company, which we today know of as the General Tire or BTR or whatever you want to call it. Their first vehicles were cars, and they were 16-passenger cars, very large in size, used for transportation like for buses and that kind of thing. But they quickly switched to doing just trucks, and that's what they're mostly known for. Their first year, they grossed over $400,000. Now, that doesn't, in today's term, seem like very much money. But if you put it into terms of today, that'd be about $12 million. That's how much business they did in their first year. All their trucks were the same color. They were all hand-painted gray, and they cost between $2,200 and $2,400. By 1916, their trucks were in demand all over the country, and they had service representatives who went out all over the country and would come back and hold conventions in Wabash at the Hotel Indiana, what we later called the Red Apple Inn, now Charlie Creek Inn. And there they would share what they were learning from the field, what people appreciated about their trucks, and what have you. A number of years ago, there was a movie made in the 1950s called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. I don't know if you've ever seen that or not, but the next time you see the black and white version of it from the 1950s, when they show the men being shot down in the building that they were in, they'll pan over and show some of the trucks that were in there. And one of the trucks sitting there is a service motor truck. And the way you can tell a service motor truck from others was on the radiator cap was made in the shape of a pyramid. And if in that movie, you'll see a Wabash service motor truck on display in the movie. That's just a side note. But anyway, by 1916, they were all over the country, and they averaged anywhere from 100 to 125 trucks a week. And their factory, their workers were treated very well. I've not seen any figures on their pay, but they actually set up a restaurant for their employees to eat at discounted prices. And that restaurant was even open to the public. It was called the Mellow Inn. It was in the big service motor building that used to sit in front of the factory. They had a doctor on hand for their employees. They were really well ahead of their time and treated them very well. They also had a football team, a basketball team, and at one point they took over a circus and operated a circus for a year with its headquarters here in Wabash. And they took it over because they had sold the circus trucks and they couldn't pay for them. So to pay off the debt, they just gave them the circus, and they kept it for a year. In 1916, they produced ambulances. for the U.S. Army. At that time, the U.S. Army was having difficulties with Mexico along the Mexican border. Some people call it the Mexican conflict. The Army had been sent there to keep Mexicans from raiding into American settlements and killing people and robbing banks. And they needed ambulances. A couple of side stories on those ambulances. The man responsible for ordering ambulances and supplies for the Mexican conflict was a man from Wabash County. And he had grown up in a small little town in LeGros Township, south of Dora, and had gone to West Point and become a U.S. officer in the Army, and he was in charge of procurement for things like that. And by the time of the war, he was a major and responsible for those procuring things. In World War I, the trucks were also used by the Army, and they had 3 orders that I know about to produce trucks and ambulances for the Army. The unusual thing about that was the Army would send a company of men with their officers, generally about 70 to 80 men, and they would stay here for a month or two to learn how to drive the trucks, learn how to maintain them, and how to service them if they broke down. 3 different times in 1918 and 1919, we had men who actually, Army soldiers who actually set up tents south of the city park and camped and stayed there while they learned how to drive these vehicles in their maintenance. They would learn to drive on the streets of Wabash. All the hills we had gave them good training in how to shift gears and that kind of thing. And of course, that led to something else that was kind of interesting. We didn't have any organizations like the Red Cross or anything like that that would have a canteen for them. But the churches, the businesses, and especially the young girls of Wabash made the young men who came here, those 70 to 80 men, feel extremely welcome. The young ladies even got together and produced a brochure of pictures of themselves and of major points of interest in Wabash that they might like to visit so that they would know what they were fighting for when they went overseas. They helped them. They took them out to dinner. They took them to the movies. They went to dances with them. I don't know what else they did, but whatever came into mind. Anyway, the men were very appreciative of that fact. And one lady in particular corresponded with at least 15 men who came here to train. I know because one day I opened my front door and there was a bag full of her letters and pictures of men who she had corresponded with. And I managed to have those transcribed, and I have those today, including their envelopes and who the men were. But anyway, that's a side story. It was kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. Another side story that made national news in 1921, when President Wilson stepped down, he had been elected out of office, and Taft was to take his place. When he left the White House, all his possessions in the White House were moved by a service motor truck. That was advertised around the country, putting Wabash right smack dab right on the front page. I must mention also that they not only made trucks, but they also made school buses, which in those days were called school hacks. They made interurban cars, and they also branched into making airplanes. And they would set up an airfield out on Cass Street and build an airport out there in which they would use their planes. They would have pilot training there. They had planes that were generally, to begin with, were from the Army after the Army had disbanded because of winning World War I. They sold a lot of their surplus and started out with their Flying Jennies, but they eventually produced their own vehicle, their own airplane, and they used it to transport parts all around the country to their truck dealerships. So they had quite a history and quite an important role to play in the automotive history and in the history of Wabash.
Do you know anyone who owned the company or started the company?
Let's see.
Might have to think on
They
that one.
actually came from out of state when they built here. They had actually wanted to build a plant in, I believe it was Iowa, but that fell through, so they moved into Wabash in 1911. The bridge and iron works that was there had a large business facility that could accommodate them. Plus, they had left a lot of equipment in there as well and that they could use. So there were some benefits. Plus, we had some men in Wabash who would promote and sell such a site and were actively promoting it and got in touch with them and brought them here. One of the men who worked there was a vice president and was from Wabash, but his name right now escapes me. I do know that he belonged to a Jewish family, but which one right now, I can't recall.
Mhm.
The plant managers were local people as well and generally had engineering degrees from places like Purdue and managed the plant for a number of years. One of the men who started as just a laborer on the line putting together the trucks, eventually, through the aid of the company, his name was Myers, he eventually went to Purdue and became an engineer with the help of Service Motor Truck. They paid for him to go and get an education. And when he came back and served here, he was invited to go to China and build a plant for them in Mukden, China in the 1920s, and did, and stayed there until World War II, when the Japanese invaded and nearly captured his family. He was able to escape and get out of there. But he lived in China for at least close to 20 years and manufactured service motor trucks, parts, and trucks like that. They gave it another name since it was in China, but one of the very first such businesses. And he gained his knowledge and expertise in Wabash and through the help of Wabash people who saw something in him as just a regular hand on the assembly line to make something of him and become an engineer. I might mention he was also a spy for the United States government. Oh, yes, he's got a very interesting history. That aspect was kind of covered up, but yes, he did report on what was going on in China during that very unusual period of time when they were being conquered, taken over by the Japanese. The fifth car that was made in Wabash was called the Champion. This is a pencil sharpener, but it's a model of what the Champion looked like. The Champion was produced, 167 of them were made in a factory on Manchester Avenue that we now today know as Ford Meterbox. Originally, the plant was the Pioneer Hat Factory that had come from New Jersey. And it's been a number of other businesses as well. But in about 1916, the Champion was made there. Now, the Champion was 188 cubic inch, 36 horsepower, L-headed, 4-cylinder engine mounted on a 110-inch wheelbase chassis made at what had been the Pioneer Hat Factory. It sold for $750, and it was shown at the Chicago Auto Show in 1916. And as I said, 167 of them were made. They didn't last very long, and then they were gone. The automobile, besides having plants made here and developing businesses in making them, and then businesses in making parts for them. And by the way, one of the businesses that made parts for early cars was the factory still located on the south side of the Wabash Street Bridge, which we call Deals. They made wooden sprockets and wooden gears for automobiles in the very beginning. They moved over from, we stole them from Peru. They moved over here, and we built the plant for them. If they would guarantee they would stay here, we'd build it. And we did. And they stayed. They're still here today. Later on, they get into making more of equipment to make furniture and plywood and that kind of thing. But that was one of the businesses that started. There was another individual, and I can't remember his name, but it was about 1918, 1919. This enterprising young man saw a way that he could make money. He had a garage. He was mechanically inclined, and he figured out a way that he could take a Ford and turn it into a sleeping car for you. He could convert it into sleeping quarters, so you could move around the country and sleep in your car if you wanted to. I don't know how he managed to do it, but he did it, and he stayed in business for a number of years with that creation and what have you. As early as I think I told you a while ago, about 1907, there were roughly 24 automobiles in Wabash County. Well, these people who had cars had a common interest, so they started a car club. In 1907, we have a car club. They started in the Indiana Clubhouse, which was located up on Hill Street, and later on, they would build a clubhouse down at Pearson's Mill at the park down there, where they could have more fun and games. Their organization was particularly interested in anything that had to do with the automobile. And in those days, there were very few laws. So they were interested in helping government regulate what kind of laws they would be. For instance, in some of those early cars, they didn't have electric lights in the front. One of the inventions they came up with was a lantern with candles in it that had been used on carriages. Another law that they had passed in Wabash was that if you came into Wabash, you had to have somebody walking in front of your car about 8 feet in front carrying a lantern announcing that you were coming. These laws didn't, they were kind of obsolete now, but then they had to deal with certain problems, and was, how do you see a car? Another problem that they dealt with was, if you have a car and it only goes 15 miles an hour, you want it to go 20. I don't know about you, but sometimes, I shouldn't say this, but when I was younger, not now, when I was younger, I'd see how fast my Ford would go. I had a Ford Galaxy 500, and one night I got it up to 92 miles an hour on a flat stretch of road called Twin Bridges. I'm sure some of your audience would also have that experience where they just wanted to see how fast it would go. And there were people in Wabash. Remember, Dr. Hauser he was speeding through Wabash at 30 miles an hour at a real early date, 1904. Well, And you saw what happened to him. His wheels got stuck in the streetcar tracks and broke off the wheel. Well, anyway, you had to have regulations. So this club advised the street department, this police, that the speed in Wabash should be 8 miles per hour downtown, and anywhere else 15 miles an hour. But downtown, slow it down to 8. Well, like I pointed out, who obeys that even today? Well, you had to have law enforcement to regulate the flow of traffic. You couldn't just have a police officer stand in the middle of the road 24 hours. And there weren't stop signs. It was just whoever got to the intersection first kept going. And that led to problems, little fender benders and that kind of thing. But you had to regulate it. So they came up with 8 miles an hour downtown and 15 elsewhere. Now you had parking problems. Even today we have parking problems in Wabash. So we really have never solved the problem, but we attempt to. And one of our first attempts was to put what were called silent policemen in the middle of the street. A silent policeman was a concrete barrier, round, that sat in the middle of the intersection, and sometimes it had a light that would flash, a red light. And everyone who got to that intersection had to stop, and then the first one who got there could go, then the next one, and so forth. Later on, they had to change that. Whoever got there first wasn't necessarily the first. So it was always the person on your right who could go if you couldn't figure out who went first. Of course, it led to fights, and then the policeman had to be called. But the silent policeman was this concrete barrier, stood in the middle of the road, and you went around it. Kind of like an early version of the circle that you find down in Indianapolis or elsewhere, unfortunately. But anyway.
The roundabouts.
Yeah, the roundabouts. And that didn't work. So they finally came up with the invention of a light that hung in the middle of the intersection, which had red and green, no yellow. Why do you need caution? Whoever gets there first goes. That didn't work. So eventually they went red, yellow, and green. And this club would advise into things of that nature and what have you. You can see there, the one other problem I was getting into is the parking. What do you do about parking when you've got a streetcar going down the middle of the street and the streets are narrow and they didn't use one-way streets? You just had to give way. And of course, the streetcars always picked up their passengers at the corner. So if you parked your car at the corner, you could park horizontal to the sidewalk. If, on the other hand, you were parked away from the corner, you could park at a 45-degree angle. So you had cars lined up on both sides of the street at 45-degree angles, and then you had traffic trying to get through. And in those early 20s and 30s, it was not unusual on a Thursday or Friday or Saturday night to see as many as 4,000 or 5,000 people downtown going to the movie houses. And you got to realize in the 1920s, we had as many as 4 movie houses going at one time. The bigger ones were called opera houses, and that would make it 6. But you had these smaller ones as well. Plus, you had all these businesses, and you had farmers coming into town. You had as many as 6 hotels in town to accommodate people to stay overnight. So sidewalks are crowded, the businesses are crowded, the streets are crowded. You've got these people parking at horizontal and then at different directions. It was really a problem for the police. Then to compound the issue, if you went down to shop, you didn't just shop you just didn't run into a store and come back out. You stayed, it was a social event. So you went from store to store to store to store to see what kind of deals you could get. Then you were always bumping into people you knew, either from work or from church or just friends. You had to stop and talk to them on the street. And then you would sit in your car and talk to your friends. So you'd stay for 6-8 hours or longer talking with friends and just having a social hour. And that was typical of Wabash in those days. The closest we have to it today is a real popular First Friday.
Mm-hmm.
That gives you just a real small taste. Plus, you have to realize you had free entertainment as well, because shops would have shows in their windows. They had people entertaining. They had circuses performing downtown. All kinds of things were going on. It was amazing. And what opened up all this? Automobiles. And the automobile held sway and still holds sway today. We think nothing of jumping into our car and going to Marion, Huntington, Fort Wayne even. And pretty soon, there'd be another invention where we wouldn't even think twice about jumping into it and flying in an airplane to have supper in Fort Wayne or Indianapolis or Chicago. It's unbelievable. And that was sitting right there waiting to be invented at the same time as the automobile, and would eventually take over, not changing our community quite as much as the car, but if the canal really changed Wabash, if the train really changed Wabash, and both did, it was the automobile that changed it forever.
Well, Mr. Woodward, that's been 1 hour.
Hi, I'm Ron Woodward, and these are the Woodward Chronicles. Thanks for listening.
The Woodward Chronicles podcast is made possible by the generous support of the Lisa Gilman Investment Fund, the Sandra Kunkel Trust, Mark and Amy Ford, Paperworks Industries, the Community Foundation of Wabash County, and Visit Wabash County, and is created by Destination Wabash County.